Hi guys and welcome to Calm Night Radio Channel. Tonight we step into Virginia in the year 1680, where the air smells of wet tobacco leaves, wood smoke and river mud, and where a society built on profit is quietly sharpening its rules into something colder. You arrive at a moment when old customs are stiffening into law, when one person's freedom can depend on a whispered claim, a parish record, or the colour of a face seen in candlelight. It is not only labour you are about to witness, but a whole world being arranged, measured, and fenced in. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And while you're here, comment with your location and local time. Now, dim the lights, and let yourself walk slowly into a colony where the morning fog hangs low over the James River, where church bells travel over damp fields, and where Black Americans wake each day inside a system that is becoming more organised, more suspicious, and far more cruel. You begin at dawn because Virginia begins at dawn. The first light comes thin and grey across the riverbanks. The water looks almost silver, though not in a cheerful way. It carries the smell of fish, silt, and long travel. Small boats creak against their moorings. Somewhere a rooster complains into the mist, and from a distant house comes the muffled thump of a door swung open for the day's work. The colony wakes with a stiff back and a hungry stomach. In 1680, Virginia is not yet the grand plantation world people often imagine from later centuries. It is still rough, improvised, and nervous. Roads are bad. Houses are often timber, drafty, and practical. Wealth exists, certainly, but it sits beside anxiety. Tobacco has made fortunes, ruined soils, and taught the colony one very clear lesson. Labour is everything. You feel that lesson everywhere. A tobacco field is not elegant. It is muddy, sticky, and tiring in a way that seems almost personal. The leaves are broad and damp. The earth clings to shoes. In summer the heat presses on your neck like a heavy hand, and in cooler months the morning air bites through coarse cloth. Everything smells green, sharp, and faintly bitter. You can almost taste the crop before it is dried. For Black Americans in 1680, daily life unfolds inside this labour-hungry world. But the larger change is not just work itself. The larger change is that colonial lawmakers are trying to define, with increasing confidence, who can be forced to work, who can be punished without much restraint, and who can expect little help from the law. This is the year you arrive in, a year of tightening. That hardening did not appear from nowhere. Earlier in the century, the status of Africans and their descendants in English colonies could still be uneven, inconsistent, and contested. Some Africans gained freedom, some owned land, some entered court. A few even held servants of their own. It was never an easy world, and it was never equal, but it was not yet shaped into the fully rigid racial system that later generations would know. By 1680, that older uncertainty is shrinking fast. You notice it first in silence. People speak carefully around power. A white planter may laugh at supper and speak casually of weather, barrels, and church attendance. Yet beneath the small talk lies a constant effort to classify human beings. Who is servant for a term? Who is slave for life? Who can testify? Who can gather? Who can move? Who can carry a weapon? The colony likes categories. Categories make profit feel tidy. And Virginia in 1680 loves tidy excuses. The lawmakers present themselves as guardians of order. They claim to fear disorder, theft, idleness, escape, and rebellion. Those fears are not invented from thin air. The colony has seen unrest, class tension, and the shocks that followed Bacon's rebellion only a few years earlier. Elite colonists have learned that unstable labour systems can turn dangerous, so they begin building a stronger wall between poor whites and black labourers. Race becomes part of the mortar. You can feel the social air changing, even if no one announces it with a trumpet. At the county court, law is not an abstract idea floating nobly above the people. It is a room, It is wood benches, damp cloaks, boots scraping the floor, and men with authority deciding what counts as truth. Ink dries on paper while lives narrow, for black people, especially enslaved black people. The court rarely feels like shelter. It feels like a place where someone else's interests have already arrived first. One mainstream fact stands out with heavy force. By this period, Virginia law had already embraced the principle that the status of a child followed the mother. That meant children born to enslaved women would also be enslaved. It sounds bureaucratic, almost bland, until you let it settle. A woman's body is not merely exploited for labour. It is turned into a mechanism for producing more property. The colony has found a way to make slavery reproduce itself. That legal rule changes the atmosphere of ordinary life. It changes how birth is regarded. It changes how planters calculate wealth. It changes how black women are watched, used, and valued by those who claim ownership over them. A cradle no longer means only family hope. In the eyes of the master class, it may also mean future labour, future sale, future profit. The cruelty is chilling precisely because it can be discussed so calmly. And calm cruelty is one of the defining sounds of this world. You hear it in a planter's voice when he speaks of hands, meaning workers, as if he were counting tools. You hear it when a local official describes punishment as discipline. You hear it when Christian language about obedience floats over a landscape built on coercion. Even the church bell can feel complicated here. It calls souls to worship, yes, but it rings over a society that is steadily teaching itself how to live with contradiction. Black Americans in 1680 are not passive figures drifting through these laws. They think, grieve, love, adapt, observe, and judge. You sense intelligence everywhere. A glance held half a second too long, a warning passed in a lowered voice. The practical knowledge of weather, tools, herbs, pathways, moods, and dangers. This world demands constant reading of risk. In the quarters, if the place can even be called quarters with much dignity, the texture of life is simple and harsh. Rough boards, packed earth, straw, perhaps, or a shared blanket that never seems quite warm enough. Smoke from a cooking fire clings to hair and cloth. Pots hold cornmeal, beans, or whatever can be managed. The smell is earthy, thin, and occasionally comforting. Hunger is familiar, so is fatigue. Yet people still carve out gestures of care. A hand resting briefly on a shoulder, food saved for someone else. A quiet song at the end of the day. One quirky detail from the period can seem almost absurd until you realise what it reveals. Colonial records show repeated anxiety about clothing, especially who wore what fabric, shoes, or hats. Lawmakers and planters worried over visible status markers with almost comic seriousness. Imagine men who cannot build a smooth road becoming deeply distressed over whether a black servant or enslaved person might appear too finely dressed. It would be funny if it were not so revealing. Clothes mattered because appearances threatened hierarchy. A decent coat could unsettle a whole philosophy, and philosophers these men were not. They were improvisers of power. They borrowed bits of English custom, bits of local practice, bits of fear, and hammered them into colonial rules. Historians still argue whether Virginia's leaders were driven more by economic logic or by racial ideology that was rapidly hardening into its own force. In truth, the two work together so closely that separating them can feel like trying to divide heat from flame. Profit fed prejudice, and prejudice helped organise profit. In daily terms, that partnership meant greater surveillance. Movement could be questioned, gatherings could be treated as suspicious. Possession of weapons by black people drew increasing alarm. The colony wanted control not only over labouring bodies, but over space itself. Where you walked mattered, whom you met mattered, how many stood together mattered. Suspicion became its own weather. There is a sound to that weather. Dogs barking at night, hooves on packed ground, a sudden knock, someone calling a name too sharply. You lie still in darkness and listen for whether danger will pass your door or stop at it. Sleep comes lightly in such a place. Yet life is not only fear. That is important. Fear is powerful, but it never fully explains a people. Black Americans in Virginia carried memories, habits, languages, rhythms, and beliefs from many parts of Africa and from the brutal crossings that had thrown them together. Some traditions survived openly, some quietly, some in altered form. Cooking methods, healing knowledge, field techniques, music, naming patterns, ways of mourning, and ways of laughing all helped build a social life that planters could not fully command. That social life is easy to overlook if you stare only at statutes and punishments, but you should not. Stand near a fire at evening and you may hear low conversation mixing sorrow with dry humour. Someone imitates a pompous overseer just enough to earn tired smiles. Someone else speaks of a remedy for fever. Someone hums a tune that does not belong to England. The stars hang overhead, cold and patient. For a few minutes, the colony's paperwork cannot reach into the circle of light. Not completely. Still, the laws keep coming. In 1680, Virginia passed legislation aimed at preventing enslaved black people from carrying weapons and from gathering in large numbers, and it authorized harsh physical punishment for those who resisted or fled. This was not a small adjustment. It was part of a broad shift toward a more militarized form of social control. The lawmakers were saying, in effect, that black presence itself must be managed as a threat. The colony was teaching whites to see black mobility not as ordinary human movement, but as danger. Once that idea settles into public life, everything changes around it. A walk becomes suspicious, a tool becomes a weapon, a meeting becomes conspiracy, a refusal becomes insolence. The legal system starts from the assumption that force is normal. You can hear the colony educating itself into brutality, and yet there is uncertainty here too, the kind scholars continue to wrestle with. Some historians question how uniformly these laws were enforced across all counties and plantations. Virginia in 1680 was not a machine that operated with neat precision. Local conditions varied, wealth varied, numbers varied. One county court might act faster than another. One master might calculate differently from his neighbour. So the lived experience could differ in degree. But the direction was unmistakable. The colony was moving toward a harder racial order. You notice how ordinary white colonists absorb that shift. A poor white labourer, who owns almost nothing and may sleep badly from his own worries, can still be offered one poisonous comfort. At least he is not black. At least the law places someone lower. It is a shabby prize. But ruling classes have long understood how effective shabby prizes can be. Status, even thin status, can calm resentment that might otherwise rise upward. So 1680 becomes more than a date. It becomes a mood, a structure of feeling, a year in which the colony is deciding, and with growing confidence, that African-descended people will form a permanent labouring class marked by law, watched by force, and denied the ordinary assumptions of freedom. The morning sun has climbed higher now. Mist burns off the river. Tobacco leaves glisten less and droop more heavily in the heat. Sweat gathers at the collar. Somewhere nearby, an axe strikes wood in a slow, punishing rhythm. You stand in that sound and understand something grim. This system is being built in plain view, not hidden in secret chambers but assembled through fields, kitchens, courtrooms, baptisms, inventories, and births. It is made of habits. It is made of paperwork. It is made of people deciding not to look too closely. And for black Americans living under these new slave laws, each day means waking inside a colony that is learning how to make injustice feel official, routine, and terribly normal. You arrive at the river landing before the sun has fully warmed the boards beneath your feet. The water is brown, slow, and heavy with tide. It smells of salt, tar, wet rope, fish scales, and old wood that never quite dries. A gull cries overhead, sharp and rude, as if even the birds here have learned to interrupt sleep. Men are already moving about with ledgers tucked under their arms. boots thudding on planks, voices clipped by habit. Nothing about the scene looks grand. It looks practical. That is what makes it worse. This is where people are turned into cargo that can speak. The landing is busy in a manner that tries to seem ordinary. Barrels wait in rows. Crates sit near the shore. A cartwheel sinks slightly into mud with a tired squeak. The river glints in patches between poles and masts. Somewhere nearby, tobacco is being packed, and the leaf smell drifts sweet and sour through the morning air. It might almost feel like a market day in a hard-working colony, except that the human beings standing under watch are not here by choice, and everyone with authority knows it. You watch black men, women, and children brought from the vessel or from holding spaces near the shore. Their clothes may be torn, mismatched, or reduced to rough garments handed out for bare utility. Skin shows marks of travel, weather, labour, or restraint. Faces hold exhaustion in different ways. Some look stunned and distant. Some scan everything with frightening alertness. Some keep their eyes lowered, not from obedience, but from calculation. Looking directly can invite attention, and attention in this place is rarely kind. The sounds press in from every side, water lapping against the hull, the creak of pulleys, a cough, a muttered prayer, a trader laughing too loudly, metal knocking wood, a child beginning to cry, then stopping with a little gulp, as if even sorrow has learned to stay quiet when danger is close. You feel the tension in your shoulders because everyone here is being measured, even you, even if only by the eyes. In 1680, Virginia to arrival does not simply mean stepping onto land. It means entering a system that immediately asks what can be extracted from your body, your skills, your age, your future children, and your remaining strength. People at the landing inspect as if they are judging livestock, though the comparison is too gentle for what is happening. Livestock are not forced to explain themselves in a language they may not know. Livestock are not made to carry memory through such humiliation. A buyer studies hands first. Hands tell him whether fingers are strong, whether palms are calloused, whether wrists suggest field work, boat work, housework, or craft potential. Teeth may be checked, shoulders assessed, legs observed. A young man might be turned slightly to gauge muscle and signs of illness. A woman may be examined with the cold arithmetic of labour and reproduction both in mind. Children draw a different kind of gaze, one that weighs years of future work not yet performed. It is a colony of practical monsters. There is a mainstream historical truth here that settles over the scene like damp fog. By the late 17th century, the English Atlantic trade was drawing increasing numbers of Africans into Virginia, and local buyers were becoming more practiced in folding these arrivals into a labour system built to keep them unfree. This was not a random scattering of tragedies. It was commerce, organised, documented, and increasingly normalised commerce. The paper matters almost as much as the person. You notice how often someone writes something down, a mark in a ledger, a note on origin, approximate age, price, or condition. A brief description that slices a whole life into a few useful words. Strong, young, woman with child, speaks little English. Good for field. Those records do not preserve personhood. They erase it with administrative neatness. The clerk dips a pen into ink, pauses, and in that pause an identity narrows. Names shift quickly here. Some people retain African names among themselves, carried like a hidden ember. Others are renamed by traders or purchasers with startling carelessness. A biblical name, an English name, a shortened sound that is easy for a master to shout across a yard. The act is both practical and symbolic. To rename someone is to announce that the old life need not concern the buyer. The colony prefers tidy beginnings, even when they're built from violent interruptions. A strange little detail from the period can make the whole business feel even more surreal. Traders and buyers sometimes showed great confidence in judging where a person came from based on language scraps, scars, body shape, or rumour from the ship. Their certainty was often flimsy. One man might declare someone from one region, another from somewhere entirely different, and both would speak as though they were scholars instead of guessing merchants in muddy boots. The colony loved categories, even when it barely understood them. You stand close enough to hear fragments of communication that slip between imposed names and remembered ones. A word of warning, a whispered question, a mother soothing a child in a language the buyer cannot follow. That hidden speech has power, even if only for a moment. It reminds everyone listening closely that the people being sold did not begin here. They arrived carrying worlds that no auction can fully inventory. Yet the system tries. Family bonds are often the first thing threatened at the water's edge. A child clings to a mother's skirt or leg. A man angles his body towards someone he knows, as if nearness itself might become protection. The trader sees these attachments too, but not as love. He sees them as variables in a sale. Sell together if it improves price. Separate if it yields more profit or suits two different buyers. In either case, another person decides. That is the terror under every movement. You cannot know whether the face beside you will still be beside you by noon. The smell of fear is real, though it is hard to describe cleanly. Sweat, damp cloth, old salt, stale breath, and the sour note of an empty stomach all mingle in the morning heat. It catches in the throat. Beside it sits another smell, just as strong. Tobacco. Money has a scent here, and it smells green, sticky, and leaf-sweet. That is one of Virginia's ugliest truths. Human misery and colonial prosperity share the same air. Not everyone at the landing is newly arrived from across the Atlantic. Some black people are resold within the colony. Some are moved by estate settlement, debt, or transfer between owners. A widow may dispose of property to stabilise her household. An executor may divide an estate with calm formality. A planter short on cash may sell one person to settle what another white man is owed. This means the water's edge is not only a place of first arrival, it is also a point of repeated rupture. A person who has already survived crossing, seasoning, and local labour can still be uprooted again because someone else's accounts are untidy. Historians still debate how much continuity of African cultural identity could be maintained in such settings of constant forced movement, especially in colonies where people from many regions were mixed together. Some scholars emphasize fragmentation and the speed of coercive adaptation. Others stress creativity, resilience, and the formation of new shared black cultures from scattered traditions. Both views hold truth. At the landing, you can feel the break and the making happening at once. Loss and reinvention stand shoulder to shoulder. Children reveal this most painfully. A small boy watches adults with the sharpened caution of someone learning too early what power sounds like. He may not understand every word, but he understands tone. He hears ownership in a buyer's voice. He hears pleading in his mother's reply. He understands when laughter is safe and when it is dangerous. A girl may be told to stand still, turn, open her mouth, or walk a few steps. Each command teaches a lesson that no child should learn, namely that strangers with money can direct your body as though you're not entirely inside it. And still, children notice odd things. The bright thread hanging from a sailor's sleeve, a dog sleeping in shade under a cart, the way river water sparkles despite everything. Human attention has a stubborn habit of wandering toward detail even in grief. That may be one small mercy of the mind. It cannot remain fixed only on terror. It reaches for texture, colour, sound, any little ledge on which to rest. For adults, the calculations are harsher. A newly arrived man may try to appear less strong if he fears brutal field placement, or more capable if he hopes specialised skill might spare him certain tasks. A woman may hide illness, hide pregnancy, or hide emotion, depending on what seems least dangerous. There is no single correct strategy. Every choice is made in fog, the buyer's mood, the trader's greed, the time of year, the labour shortage, and pure chance all shape outcomes. Survival here depends partly on intelligence and partly on the terrible fact that intelligence cannot control everything. Religion lurks around the edges of the scene too. Some English colonists speak of Christian duty while buying human beings in the same afternoon. Baptism does not guarantee freedom. Piety does not erase profit. A man may quote scripture with one hand resting on a ledger. The hypocrisy is so complete it becomes almost sleepy. That is often how large moral failures work, not with dramatic villainous speeches, but with routine, paperwork, and people who have trained themselves not to feel the full meaning of their own acts. You notice small resistance, even here, a refusal to answer quickly, a glance exchange that carries memory, a person holding upright posture under inspection, denying the buyer the comfort of total collapse. These actions do not overturn the sale. They do something quieter. They protect an inner edge of self. In a place built to reduce people to price, that edge matters. Another quirky tidbit survives in scattered records and traveller remarks. Buyers often prize certain supposed ethnic traits, claiming one group was more suited to rice, another to cattle, another to domestic work, as if the whole continent of Africa were a catalogue of labour stereotypes waiting for English convenience. The confidence of these claims is almost laughable. The consequences were not. Such fantasies influenced who was purchased, where people were sent, and how they were treated. By midday, the sun has changed the landing. The boards are hotter now. Flies drift where they should not. The river smell thickens. Men remove hats and wipe their brows. A bargain takes longer than expected because a trader insists on a higher price for a woman described as healthy and likely to bear children. The phrase hangs in the air with a dreadful flatness. Here, fertility becomes market language. The colony is not merely buying labour in the present, it is buying future generations. You watch a sale close with a handshake. That is one of the hardest gestures to bear. Two men clasp hands over a life as if finishing the purchase of timber. The gesture is neat, almost cheerful. It gives the transaction the appearance of honourable business. Meanwhile, a person who has done nothing wrong is led away toward a road, a cart, a yard, a field, or a house where entirely new rules will govern every hour. The river landing swallows these partings with brutal efficiency. Another group is brought forward. Another inspection begins. Commerce hates delay. Yet even amid that machinery, memory keeps working. A tune half-hummed, a phrase spoken under breath, a scar recognised by someone from the same coast or inland region, a cooking method remembered later from this same day. Identity is wounded here, but it is not simply erased on command. It clings to the senses, to smell, to rhythm, to kinship terms, to the body's memory of the home landscapes far from Virginia mud. As the afternoon light turns thicker and more golden, the landing begins to look almost peaceful to an untrained eye. The river softens, shadows lengthen under barrels. The ordinary business of a colony continues around the extraordinary violence it has decided to call normal. That is the lesson of this place. The water's edge is not only where ships arrive, it is where Virginia rehearses its future, one sail at a time, teaching itself to treat black lives as entries in commerce, while those very lives struggle, with immense courage, to remain human inside the count. Morning begins before the sky is ready for it. You wake in darkness that is not fully night and not yet dawn, with the air inside the cabin close and faintly sour from smoke, damp wool and sleeping bodies. Someone shifts nearby, a board creaks, breath rises in the chill. For one small moment, before thought catches up, there is the soft confusion of waking anywhere. Then the day returns to you all at once, and the body understands before the mind does. Work is coming. Outside, the colony is still mostly shadow. The ground feels cold beneath bare feet or worn shoes. Dew slicks the grass. Mud waits in the ruts. Somewhere across the yard a door bangs open, and the sound carries sharply in the thin morning air. Dogs stir. A horse stamps. Then comes the human noise that matters most, a voice calling people into motion, flat with habit. Not loud, because it does not need to be. Authority that is used every day rarely wastes its breath. You step into labour almost immediately. For black Americans in Virginia in 1680, work is not a task placed inside life. It is the structure around which life is forced to bend. The day is measured by what must be planted, cut, carried, cooked, scrubbed, lifted, mended, boiled, stacked, spun, driven, or watched. Even weather does not truly interrupt the demand. Rain changes the work. Heat changes the work. Illness changes the pace for a few hours, if you are lucky, but the requirement itself remains. Labour sits over the day like a roof with no door. In the tobacco fields, the light comes slowly, silver first, then pale gold, then a brighter wash that shows every leaf and clod of earth. Tobacco is a needy crop. That is one of the first truths you feel in your back. It wants endless attention, weeding, hilling, worming, topping, cutting, hanging, drying, stripping, packing. The plant is almost fussy in its demands, yet the colony builds its wealth around it as if pampering tobacco were the most natural use of human life. The rows stretch ahead, damp and close. Leaves brush your arms with a clammy touch. They leave stickiness on the skin. Mud pulls at the feet. Gnats collect near the face. The smell is green, bitter, and heavy, with a sweetness that turns unpleasant when the sun rises higher. By midday, the heat sits on your shoulders like wet cloth. Sweat stings the eyes. Dust clings where the mud has dried. The body becomes a tool expected to continue without opinion. And still, bodies keep their opinions. A shoulder tightens, fingers cramp, knees complain. The lower back sends its sharp little warnings. You learn the exact angle at which pain can be endured and the exact movement that will make it worse. You learn how to save effort in secret, how to lift with help from the thigh, how to shift weight while appearing still, how to steal one extra breath before bending again. The body becomes both prisoner and teacher. A mainstream fact of this world is plain enough. Tobacco labour in 17th century Virginia was relentless, seasonal, and deeply exhausting, demanding careful handwork rather than only bursts of brute strength. That matters, because it destroys a common fantasy that plantation work was merely rough muscle without skill. Tobacco required timing, judgment, and attention. Planters wanted disciplined labour because the crop itself demanded it. The cruelty lay not only in the amount of work, but in the fact that intelligence and care were extracted without freedom. The field is only one part of it. Some black Americans labour inside or near the main house, where the work changes shape but not pressure. In the kitchen the heat can feel almost alive. Fires crackle under iron pots. Steam dampens the air. Ash settles in corners. You smell onions, herbs, meat when there is meat, and the constant smoky note of wood burning down. Hands chop, stir, lift, scrape, knead, wash, and carry. A meal that appears simple on a planter's table may have taken hours of standing in heat, lifting water, grinding meal, cleaning pots, and keeping children or animals away from the food. Household labour demands alertness of a different kind. In the field, nature and overseers watch you. In the house, every gesture may be watched. Whether the floor is swept clean, whether linen is folded properly, whether a cup is set down too hard, whether a child in the master's family is answered quickly enough. Silence matters. Expression matters. The angle of the face can matter. Some tasks require physical stamina, others require controlled invisibility, which may be even more tiring. To be present but not too present, useful but never fully acknowledged, is its own form of strain. The laundry has its own misery. Water hauled, shirts scrubbed, lye soap biting the hands, cloth wrung out again and again. In cool weather, the skin numbs. In warm weather, steam and sweat mix until you feel boiled yourself. There is no elegant way to describe washing heavy linens by hand. It is hard, repetitive work, and by the end your fingers seem less like part of you and more like objects that ache. Then there are barns, yards, and workshops. A black man skilled with timber may split rails, shape planks, mend carts, or assist in building outbuildings. Another may handle livestock, clean stalls, repair fences, or slaughter animals when required. Someone else may work with iron, tools, or barrels if the owner values craft as much as field strength. Such labour can look, from a distance, more varied and perhaps less monotonous than tobacco rows, but variation is not the same as ease. Skilled work often brings heavier scrutiny because mistakes cost money. A craftsperson may be relied upon and yet remain fully unfree. The colony has no trouble praising ability while denying the person who possesses it. You notice how the day divides not by comfort but by demand. Early morning for starting, mid-morning for steady pace, noon for a short intake of food if granted, afternoon for the long drag when sunlight seems to thicken and time becomes mean, evening for carrying, sorting, feeding animals, cleaning tools, or preparing the next day's needs. Darkness is not always an ending. Sometimes it is simply poorer light in which to continue. Food is quick and practical: cornmeal, porridge, beans, a bit of salt meat if available, perhaps greens, perhaps nothing much until later. The smell of a simple pot can feel almost luxurious when hunger has sharpened the senses. Even coarse bread seems warm and kind in the hand. You eat fast because time is watched, and because hard work teaches the body to treat food less as pleasure than as fuel. Still, taste lingers: smoke, salt, grain. A trace of sweetness from something boiled down. Tiny comforts matter enormously when the rest of the day belongs to someone else. There is an odd detail in colonial records and commentary that tells you something important. Planters often complained about workers being slow, lazy, sulky, or stubborn, as if the mystery of human reluctance under compulsion had somehow escaped them. Imagine commanding people by force from dawn to dark and then acting puzzled that they do not sing with gratitude. The complaint itself becomes absurd. It reveals more about the master's self-pity than about the labourer's character. Of course, slowness could be strategy. Resistance does not always arrive with dramatic speeches. Sometimes it is a dropped tool that takes an extra moment to retrieve. Sometimes a task is done exactly as ordered, with no voluntary efficiency added. Sometimes a person protects energy because exhaustion can injure or kill. Sometimes small sabotage appears in ways hard to prove: a delay here, a miscount there, a little less haste than demanded. These acts do not dismantle the system, but they complicate it. They remind you that forced labour is never completely secure. It must keep pushing because consent is absent. Women carry especially layered burdens. A black woman may labour in the field, then cook, then mend, then care for children, then rise again before dawn to repeat the cycle. Colonial categories often pretend to separate work neatly into male and female spheres, but necessity has no such politeness. Women haul, hoe, lift, nurse, wash, plant, carry, soothe, and endure. The body is treated as infinitely available. Pregnancy may alter tasks in practice, but not always as much as mercy would suggest. The colony is not known for mercy. Children work too, though adults may try to shield them when they can. A child begins with carrying water, collecting wood, minding younger children, chasing poultry, or fetching tools. Nothing is called a childhood in the soft modern sense. Play exists in fragments, in the margins between orders, but usefulness comes early. A little pair of hands is noticed quickly in a place where every hand can be turned toward work. Historians still disagree about how much autonomy enslaved labourers could exercise in organising the rhythms of tasks on smaller holdings, where direct supervision was less constant. On some properties, especially where owners relied on trusted drivers or were absent, people may have negotiated pace, timing, and methods more than the laws suggest. On others, surveillance was close and harsh. What remains certain is that any autonomy was conditional, fragile, and always vulnerable to the will of the owner. A bit of working space is not freedom, it is merely breathing room inside coercion. The senses never leave the story. Sound is constant, hose striking earth, leaves rustling, pigs rooting and squealing, buckets knocking against each other, a baby fussing from somewhere near the cabins, the rasp of a saw, the slap of wet linen, the clink of chain on a harness. Human voices drift in and out, some stern, some weary, some soft enough to be almost private. At times the whole plantation seems like one large machine built from wood, mud, crop, and breath. Touch tells another truth. Splinters in the palm, blisters reopening, sun on the neck, cold water over chapped fingers, the roughness of homespun cloth, the burn of iron pot handles, the tickle of tobacco leaves against skin. Even rest has texture, a wall at your back, packed earth underfoot, a bench edge against the thigh. The body is always receiving the world, even when the world gives little kindness in return. Smell may be the strongest guide of all. Fresh-cut wood, horse sweat, tallow, corn mush, damp wool, human fatigue. Night soil from a pit, too near the cabins. Wild mint crushed underfoot by accident, and releasing a brief clean scent that vanishes almost at once. Smoke from evening fires settling low in the air. In such a life, smell can announce what sort of hour it is before a clock ever could. And clocks, in any case, are for the powerful. You do not need one to know when the afternoon has become the longest part of the day. The light turns thick and white. Shadows shrink. Tempers shorten. Muscles feel used up but must continue. This is the hour when labour feels least human and most mechanical, as if your own arms belong to some other creature that has been hired without your permission. Yet even then the mind keeps moving. It remembers songs. It counts. It notices clouds building in the west. It measures who is watching and who is not. Inner life persists stubbornly beneath outer fatigue. That persistence matters because labour under slavery aims not just to gain work, but to shape the worker's sense of self. The message is repeated daily. Your time is not yours. Your strength belongs elsewhere. Your talents enrich another household. Your tiredness carries no moral claim. Against that message stands the quiet fact of personhood. Renewed each time someone shares food, warns a friend, comforts a child, mutters a joke, or gazes toward the woods and imagines a wider horizon. Evening eventually arrives, though not as a grand release. The sun lowers, the air cools a little. The field smell deepens into earth and leaf. Tools are gathered, animals fed, fires started, supper made from whatever is at hand. The first swallow of water after a long day can feel like a blessing. So can sitting down. So can taking off a shoe. Tiny reliefs gain the size of miracles when earned through such effort. The colony may see only output. Pounds packed, fences mended, meals served, floors cleaned, children tended. It counts labour because counting is what power does best. But from inside the day, the truth feels different. It is not simply a list of tasks. It is a struggle between demand and endurance, between extraction and self-preservation, between a system that wants every useful motion and a human being who must somehow remain a human being while giving it. Night gathers slowly over the yard. Smoke lifts into dimming blue. Insects start their dry music. The body trembles with weariness once stillness finally arrives. Tomorrow already waits like an unwelcome visitor at the door. Yet for this brief hour, with the heat dropping from the ground and voices softening around the fire, you can feel something the work never fully conquers. Not freedom, not safety. Something smaller and still precious. The stubborn fact that beneath the colony's appetite, the worker remains a person, breathing in the dusk, hands sore, heart awake, and not yet emptied by the day. The courthouse does not look grand enough to hold so much power. You approach it in the pale morning, when the air still carries a chill from the night and the packed dirt outside is marked by wagon wheels, hoof prints, and the flat impressions of many boots. The building is plain timber, practical and a little weather-beaten, with a roof that has endured more seasons than elegance. Smoke drifts somewhere nearby from a hearth. Damp wool, mud, and horse smell mingle in the yard. A man clears his throat and spits. Another adjusts his hat and steps inside as if entering any ordinary place of business. That is the unsettling part. For the colony, this is ordinary. Inside, the room is all rough surfaces and authority, wooden benches, a table scarred by ink and elbows, papers stacked with solemn care, candles if the light is poor. Men with legal standing sit as if their sitting itself is important. They speak of order, property, discipline, trespass, inheritance, contracts, and Christian duty. Their voices stay measured, their hands remain clean. Yet the decisions formed in this room can send pain outward across fields and yards for years. For black Americans in 1680, the law is not a neutral wall protecting everyone beneath the same roof. It is more like a gate watched by men who already know whom they mean to admit. The law does not simply describe inequality here, it actively manufactures it, then pretends to be shocked when the result looks cruel. You feel that cruelty first in what is missing. A white servant might sometimes complain, petition, or leave a trace in court records that marks him as a person wronged. He is not powerful, but he exists in law as someone with a term, a contract, or a grievance that might at least be heard. A black person, especially an enslaved one, stands on thinner ground. What counts as injury when the system treats you as property? What counts as theft when your own labour has already been stolen? The questions curl back on themselves in this room until justice begins to look like a joke told without smiling. One central fact weighs over everything. Virginia law in this period increasingly granted masters broad power over enslaved people, while sharply limiting legal protections for those held in bondage. Courts did not need to announce that they hated black people in every sentence. The structure itself did the speaking. When ownership is prioritized over personhood, the verdict has been implied before anyone enters the room. You hear it in the language. Men say servant when they mean slave, because the softer word feels tidier. They say correction when they mean beating. They say runaway as if the deeper crime were movement rather than captivity. They say disorder when black people gather, but not when white men profit from human misery. The colony is very skilled at polishing ugly things until they sound almost respectable. It would be almost impressive if it were not so vicious. A clerk scratches with his quill and records what matters to the court. That act of recording has a quiet violence of its own. Ink decides what becomes official memory. A person's suffering may appear only as a brief line attached to someone else's complaint. Lost labour, damaged property, value diminished. The human event is squeezed into terms the court can tolerate. Pain becomes bookkeeping. Family separation becomes transfer. This is how injustice trains itself to look calm. Black people do appear in court records, though often in ways shaped by white interests. They may be listed in estate inventories, suits over debt, disputes about ownership, punishment cases, or parish matters involving baptism and identity. A few may testify indirectly, or have words reported through others, but the system is deeply uneven. Even when a black person's presence is acknowledged, it is often filtered through white mouths, white ink, white conclusions. The court listens through a wall, then declares the sound complete. The building itself seems to understand hierarchy, the better seats, the hats removed or not removed, the way some men speak across the room while others stand waiting to be noticed. A black person brought into this space is rarely allowed the comfort of casual posture. Every movement is watched for insolence, hesitation, or fear. You can feel how the room wants submission. It is arranged for it. A small but telling detail from the era reveals the mind of the place. Colonial lawmakers often obsessed over who could bear arms, gather at night, or leave a plantation without permission. Imagine having a society so brittle that the sight of black people walking together after dark fills you with panic. It would be laughable if the consequences were not written into law. The fear says less about the supposed danger of black life than about the guilty nerves of those who built their comfort on coercion. In 1680, Virginia passed a law tightening control over enslaved black people who carried weapons or left their master's land without authorization, and it allowed severe punishment against those who resisted capture. The statute did not emerge from nowhere. It reflected a colony increasingly determined to treat black mobility as a threat that should be crushed quickly and legally. Once force enters the law this openly, violence no longer needs much excuse. It simply needs a witness willing to call it proper. You stand near the doorway as a matter involving punishment is discussed with unnerving ease. No one shouts, no one pounds the table. A magistrate asks questions in a cool tone. A planter answers with offended dignity, as though his management has been unfairly doubted. The focus settles not on the suffering inflicted, but on whether the owner's rights were maintained and whether order was restored. The language remains polished while the truth underneath is blunt. A black body has been hurt because the colony considers such hurting useful. That is one of the great tricks of power. It teaches people to discuss brutality as procedure. Historians still dispute how consistently some of these laws were applied across Virginia's scattered counties. Local custom mattered. Wealth mattered. Reputation mattered. A powerful planter could shape outcomes differently from a poorer one. Some magistrates may have moved with more caution, others with sharper eagerness. The colony was not perfectly uniform. Yet from inside the uncertainty, the pattern remains clear enough. The law bent toward mastery. It did not lean gently, it leaned hard. Even free black people feel the courtroom's cold attention. Freedom in this colony is narrow, conditional, and forever questioned when attached to a black body. A free black man may own tools, labour for wages, rent land, or bring a claim in some circumstances. But every legal interaction carries the pressure of racial suspicion. Papers matter, parish records matter, witnesses matter, reputation matters. One missing document or one hostile white neighbour can turn ordinary life into a trap. Freedom exists, but it is forced to wear proof around its neck like a charm against the colony's bad intentions. There is a smell in the room that never changes. Ink, dust, damp fabric drying slowly, tallow from candles, human closeness. It is the smell of paperwork trying to pass for civilization. Outside, the world has movement, weather, birds, mud, smoke, children, river wind. Inside, everything narrows into categories: debtor, widow, servant, negro, mulatto, property. The clerk writes as if naming were understanding, and the court proceeds as if understanding were justice. A man on the bench quotes English custom. Another invokes the king. The words travel across the room with self-importance. Yet what reaches black listeners is something simpler. The law belongs to others. It was not written with your comfort in mind. It was not designed to notice the texture of your fear or the reason for your silence. It asks first what white society needs to preserve itself. Your humanity enters only if convenient. That truth changes daily behaviour far from the courthouse. A person chooses words more carefully because complaints can backfire. Someone avoids travelling without clear permission because any question from a patrol or neighbour could escalate. A family keeps precious papers hidden from damp and fire, because those papers may one day stand between a free person and forced labour. Mothers instruct children to be cautious, not because caution is virtuous in itself, but because the law has such eager teeth. Even those who never enter the courtroom live beneath its shadow. You can see how white colonists learn from the system too. A poor white man may possess little land and less grace, yet he absorbs the lesson that the law places him above black people by default. That lesson flatters him. It gives him a rank he has not earned, and a confidence he may wear like borrowed finery. The ruling class benefits greatly from this arrangement. Divide the labouring population by race, and some resentments that might have climbed upward instead settle sideways. It is a shabby strategy. It works far too well. One quirky but revealing feature of colonial legal culture is how much weight could be attached to oaths, swearing formulas, and performances of Christian respectability, even in a society drenched in exploitation. A planter might beat a person bloody, then appear in court groomed, composed, and very interested in proper procedure. He knows how to nod at the right moment, quote, duty, and look burdened by responsibility. The courtroom loves this costume. It mistakes polished manners for moral seriousness with exhausting regularity. Meanwhile, black people develop their own legal intelligence. That intelligence may not look like books or Latin phrases. It appears as keen awareness of which magistrate is hardest, which neighbour might testify honestly, which minister records baptisms carefully, which scraps of paper matter, which words to avoid, which moments to stay silent, and which moments to insist on a point. A free black woman guarding proof of status knows law in the deepest practical sense. An enslaved man who understands how far a master can push before attracting official notice also knows law, though the knowledge is born from danger rather than privilege. The county jail, if there is one nearby, adds another layer of dread. It is small, cramped, and unpleasant. More cage than institution. The smell of stale air, waste, wet straw, and unwashed bodies lingers at the edges of any legal proceeding involving confinement. To be held there while awaiting a decision is to feel time itself harden. Yet even the jail operates within the same logic. It is not built chiefly for black protection. It is built for control. Religion continues to float around the legal world like a pious mist. Officials speak of maintaining Christian society, as if the phrase itself blesses the arrangement. Baptism once raised awkward questions about whether a Christian could be held as a slave. By this period, colonial law had worked to close that opening. Christianity would not be allowed to interfere with property relations. The colony wanted both profit and moral comfort, which meant theology had to become flexible in all the ugliest places. You watch a dispute over ownership proceed with terrible composure. A person is discussed in terms of age, health, labour value, and previous possession. There is argument over evidence, perhaps over witnesses, perhaps over debt. The person at the centre waits while white men debate who has the stronger claim. No one asks the most obvious question. What if no one has a rightful claim to another human being at all? That idea remains too disruptive for the room. Better to argue over paperwork than principle. Yet principles are present, just hidden in plain sight. The principle that whiteness deserves protection. The principle that wealth deserves stability. The principle that black labour can be extracted with force and then defended with legal language. These are not written on the wall, but the whole building seems constructed from them. By afternoon the room grows stuffy. Sunlight angles through a window and catches dust in the air. Men shift on benches. Someone coughs. A clerk flexes cramped fingers. The proceedings continue because law, once established, always has more work to do on behalf of power. There will be another petition, another inventory, another accusation, another claim of disorder to correct. The colony is busy manufacturing obedience and calling the product peace. You leave the courthouse with the smell of ink still in your nose and the murmur of official voices lingering in your ears. Outside, the air feels wider. Even the mud looks honest compared with what happens indoors. A breeze moves through the trees. Somewhere in the distance an axe strikes wood. Somewhere else a child laughs, briefly, before being hushed. Life continues in all directions, but the law has reached into it already, shaping how people walk, speak, gather, inherit, labour, and fear. That is the true power of this place. Not merely that punishments are ordered here, but that everyday life far beyond its walls begins to arrange itself in anticipation of what the law might do. For Black Americans in 1680, the courthouse is not just a building. It is a machine that teaches the colony whom to trust, whom to doubt, whom to own, and whom to leave unprotected. It does not have to roar. A scratch of quill is enough. In that quiet sound, whole lives are narrowed, and the colony calls the narrowing order. Night leaves slowly in the living spaces set aside for black families. If family is even the word the colony would allow without flinching. The darkness thins through cracks in the wall. Cold air slips in first, followed by a dull grey light that reveals rough boards, hard corners, and the shapes of people who have learned how to rest in very little room. Smoke from last night's fire still clings to the rafters. It hangs low, mixed with a smell of damp earth, sweat dried into cloth, and ashes that never fully cool. Someone coughs. A child turns in sleep. For a few breaths, the room feels almost still. Then watchfulness returns. Home, in this world, is not the same as privacy. It is shelter without real security, warmth without ownership, family life without legal protection. You can stir a pot, mend a shirt, hush a child, share a joke, and lean your tired back against a wall. Yet none of these ordinary acts are guaranteed space to breathe. At any hour, the place can be entered, counted, questioned, searched, or rearranged by someone with power over it. Even tenderness must keep one ear open. The cabin is plain, sometimes brutally plain. A packed dirt floor, a few crude stools, if there are stools, straw bedding, or pallets made from whatever can be spared, blankets thin enough to make winter seem personal, a pot hanging near the hearth, wooden bowls, perhaps a spoon or two, perhaps not enough, corn husks tucked into cracks, a little cloth hidden away because every usable thing matters. The touch of the room is rough everywhere. Splintered wood, coarse fabric, cold draughts on ankles. The comforting softness of home has to be invented here from scraps. And still, it is invented. That is one of the strongest truths inside these quarters. Black families and communities make domestic life where the colony has offered only accommodation for labour. They shape order from disorder. They save bits of food, patch garments, share tools, pass down names, tell stories, soothe sickness, settle quarrels, and create a rhythm of belonging beneath constant surveillance. Home becomes an act, not a possession. It lives in what people do for one another. The fire is often the centre of that act. Its smell settles into everything. Smoke in hair, smoke in blankets, smoke in the pores of the walls. The fire cooks porridge, warms stiff hands, dries damp cloth, and throws just enough light for evening talk. You hear the crackle of wood, the scrape of a pot, the little hiss when something spills onto the coals. In the cold season, that small heat feels almost sacred. In warmer weather, it adds one more layer of discomfort to an already crowded space. Yet no one dismisses it. Fire means food, and food means the household has made it through another day. A mainstream historical fact sits heavily inside every domestic scene. Enslaved marriages and family bonds were not reliably recognised or protected by colonial law. People formed deep attachments, called one another husband, wife, mother, father, son, daughter. But the legal system did not honour those relationships the way it honoured white households. That meant love existed under threat. A spouse could be sold, a child could be moved. A mother's authority over her own children could be overridden by ownership. Family life survived, but it survived in defiance of the legal order rather than because of it. You feel the strain of that truth most clearly in silence. A man comes in after labour and sits with his elbows on his knees, staring at the fire for a few moments before speaking. He's tired, certainly, but there is also the tiredness of calculation. Is everyone here tonight? Has anyone been called away? Did the master mention a debt, a move, an inventory, a marriage in the big house, a death in the county, a reason that might bring changes to this yard? Domestic life is full of ordinary concerns everywhere in the world, but here every ordinary concern is shadowed by one larger question. Will this household still exist tomorrow in the same form it exists tonight? Women carry the heaviest burden of holding home together. After field work or domestic service, many still return to tasks that make family life possible. Cooking, washing, nursing infants, cleaning minor wounds, braiding hair, mending clothes by dim light, calming frightened children, stretching food so it reaches one more bowl. There is no applause for this labour. The colony barely notices it until something fails, yet without it, the entire system would crack more quickly than masters care to admit. Survival depends on women's work inside the home just as much as it depends on labour in the field. A child's world inside the quarters is shaped by contrasts: hunger, but also comfort, fear, but also play, rules from above, and lessons from within the household that are wiser and more precise. A child learns where not to wander, how to keep quiet when danger is near, which adults can be trusted, how to carry a small bundle, how to mind younger siblings, how to read moods in footsteps before a face appears at the door. Such children become alert early, too early. Yet they also laugh, chase one another, invent games from pebbles or sticks, and fall asleep with astonishing speed after tears. Childhood is narrowed here, but not erased. You notice how sound behaves differently at home. In the fields, sound is exposure. At home, it can become shelter, a soft murmur between adults, a lullaby under the breath, the repeated scrape of corn being ground, wooden bowls tapping gently together, the rhythm of someone sewing, rain on the roof, wind teasing the walls. Even the snore of an exhausted sleeper can feel reassuring. It means one person, at least for this moment, has dropped out of alertness and into rest. Food is rarely abundant, yet meals matter far beyond their size. A pot of cornmeal mush, beans, greens, or salted scraps can gather people around a shared centre. Steam rises, the smell is simple and honest. Earthy beans, sweetness from corn, smoke from the fire, salt when there is enough. A bowl warms the hands before it fills the stomach. People eat quickly at times, but not always without conversation. Someone comments on the day. Someone complains with dry wit. Someone tells a child not to gulp. That exchange, small as it is, builds household life against a system designed to reduce everyone to labour units. One quirky detail from plantation archaeology and records is how often small personal objects turn up in domestic spaces. Beads, pins, pottery fragments, bits of ornament, modified tools, and other tiny possessions that had no grand monetary value. These items matter because they suggest the urge to decorate, customize, save, and claim some piece of daily life as one's own. Even in deprivation, people still wanted a little beauty, a little distinctness, a little control over the texture of the ordinary. Human beings are stubborn that way. Thank heaven for that. Care for the sick reveals another layer of home under pressure. Illness moves easily through cramped spaces. Fever, cough, stomach trouble, injury. All can pass quickly when people are crowded and underfed. A child burns hot with fever. A woman mixes herbs. A man dampens a cloth and lays it across a brow. Someone whispers a prayer. Someone else remembers a remedy from a parent or elder. Medicine is improvised from knowledge carried across oceans, knowledge learned in the colony, and whatever ingredients can be found nearby. The law may not value black life, but black households do, intensely and practically, one poultice and one spoonful at a time. There is also discipline within the quarters, though it grows from care rather than domination. An elder corrects a child for wandering too far. A parent scolds a teenager for speaking rashly where others can hear. A relative insists on finishing chores before rest. These small corrections are about keeping life intact under dangerous conditions. Obedience in the household can mean safety outside it. The line between caution and fear is thin, but families walk it every day. Historians still debate how much space enslaved people in 17th century Virginia had to form stable household patterns on smaller farms compared with larger properties. On small holdings, some argue that close proximity to owners made domestic autonomy harder. Others note that local variation could sometimes allow more flexibility in family arrangements or garden keeping. The evidence is uneven because the records rarely cared to capture black domestic life in full. What remains beyond doubt is that home existed most powerfully where records were weakest, in nightly routines, kin ties, shared labour, and memories held between people rather than in official papers. Gardens, when allowed, can make the difference between mere survival and a slightly fuller life. A patch of greens, beans climbing sticks, herbs for healing and flavour, perhaps a squash trailing low. The smell of fresh soil near a cabin can feel strangely hopeful. Tending such a plot after forced labour is exhausting, almost absurd, and yet deeply rational. It gives food, knowledge, and a small zone of decision-making. Planting something of your own in stolen time is not freedom. Still, it carries a whisper of agency the system cannot entirely digest. Night offers a different kind of household life. Once the last chores slow and a darkness settles around the cabins, voices soften, faces are lit by firelight or moonlight through the cracks. A mother smooths a child's hair. Someone tells a tale with just enough humour to make adults smile and children stare wide-eyed. A man rubs his wrists and speaks little. An older woman hums while repairing cloth. In these hours, memory enters more easily. Memories of places across the ocean. Memories of parents now gone. Memories of songs whose full words have thinned but whose melody still lingers. Home is built partly from what is remembered together. Surveillance never disappears completely. That is what keeps the comfort from becoming ease. A door may open suddenly. An order may come from the main house. A count may be taken. A warning may reach the quarters that someone nearby has been questioned, punished, or sold. The atmosphere can shift in an instant. A child feels it before understanding it. Adults straighten, voices lower. The room becomes guarded again. This quick change from warmth to caution is one of the defining textures of domestic life under slavery. The heart is never allowed to rest all the way down, and yet affection persists openly enough to be felt. A hand pressed at the back as someone passes. Shared laughter over a small absurdity. A baby bounced on a knee. Hair braided with care. The saving of the best bite for someone weaker. The wrapping of a blanket around another person's shoulders before your own. These are not grand gestures. They are daily acts of loyalty, and they carry enormous weight. The system depends on extraction. The household answers with care, not always gently, not always perfectly, but persistently. The sleeping arrangements at night tell their own story. Bodies close for warmth, for lack of space, and for reassurance. You hear breathing settle in stages, a restless child, an exhausted adult gone suddenly still, the snap of wood deep in the fire, rats somewhere in the dark if the place is poorly kept or the season unkind. Outside, wind moves across the yard and a dog barks once, then again. Every sound is measured for threat. Still, sleep comes because sleep must come. Even fear has limits when the body is spent. You lie there and understand that home under slavery is a paradox held together by love and vigilance. It is fragile but not weak. It can be interrupted, but it is rebuilt nightly. It lacks legal standing, secure walls, and private peace. Yet it contains knowledge no law can manufacture. How to comfort, how to endure, how to laugh quietly, how to keep children alive, how to grieve without surrendering all joy. These things are learned in the dark, beside small fires, on rough bedding, in rooms where nothing seems sufficient and yet somehow enough is made for one more night. By the time sleep finally settles over the cabin, the air is cooler, the smoke smell is softened, the last ember glows red and low. The room is still crowded, still poor, still vulnerable to every outside command. None of that has changed. What has changed is something harder for the colony to measure. A household has gathered itself again. A network of care has done its work, under the eye of power, under the threat of sail, under walls thin enough to hear the weather through. People have made a home out of presence, memory, labour, and tenderness. In a world determined to own bodies, that quiet making of home is its own form of strength. Evening gathers differently when people have almost nothing and still refuse to become empty. The light fades over the yard in thin layers, gold first, then grey, then a blue so soft it seems to hush the trees. Smoke rises from the cooking fires and settles low when the air cools. You smell ash, boiled greens, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of crushed grass under tired feet. Somewhere a child laughs too loudly and is gently hushed. Somewhere a pot lid rattles. Somewhere a man clears his throat and spits into the dirt after a day of dust and leaf. The plantation sounds less like a workplace now and more like a cluster of breathing lives trying to reclaim themselves from the hours. This is when memory gets stronger, not because work disappears. It does not. There are still bowls to wash, children to settle, cloth to mend, and bodies to soothe. But the edge comes off command for a little while, and into that slight opening comes song, prayer, story, habit, gesture, and all the inward things that power cannot fully inventory. The colony can count labourers. It cannot easily count what they carry within. For black Americans in 1680, faith is rarely simple, and almost never singular. It may include words learned from English Christians, bits of scripture heard through a master's religion, and older forms of reverence carried across the Atlantic or preserved in fragments through elders, rhythm, healing, and remembrance. What survives does not always survive in pure form. It survives in mixed form, altered form, whispered form. Yet survival itself is the point. You notice first the way people gather, not always in large groups, that would invite trouble. Sometimes only a few sit close enough to speak softly while children doze nearby. Sometimes one person begins humming, and another joins without lifting their head. Sometimes a woman pauses over a kettle and murmurs words that are half prayer, half thought, meant for God, ancestors, memory, or simply the night. The sound is low and steady. It is the opposite of the courtroom. No one here pretends power makes a thing true. The truth is felt in the body. A mainstream historical fact rests quietly beneath this scene. Enslaved Africans and their descendants in 17th century English America preserved religious and cultural practices in many blended and changing forms, even as owners pushed Christian instruction or tried to regulate gatherings. There was no single uniform belief system among black people in Virginia. Different regions of Africa had brought different spiritual traditions, and colonial pressure changed how openly those traditions could be expressed. What remained constant was the human need for meaning, protection, mourning, gratitude, and hope. You can feel that need in the cadence of her voice. A woman speaks over a sick child with careful repetition, touching the forehead, then the chest, then adjusting the blanket with hands that smell faintly of herbs. She may invoke the Christian God. She may use words inherited from older traditions. She may not separate the two as sharply as later scholars would like. To her, what matters is whether the child sleeps easier, breathes deeper, and comes through the night. Faith here is practical. It sits beside medicine, memory, and love. Song moves differently from speech. It can travel under a breath and still carry a whole world. One person begins with a line that bends on the last note. Another answers. The melody is not polished for performance. It is lived in. It rocks gently, like work rhythm softened into rest. The words may be few. The tune may shift from voice to voice. A child listening nearby learns it without being formally taught. That is how culture often survives under pressure, not as an announcement, but as repetition wrapped in ordinary life. And sometimes humour slips in too. That is one of the colony's great disappointments. Surely, even under crushing conditions, people still find things ridiculous. A man mimics the pompous way an overseer clears his throat before offering useless advice. A woman raises an eyebrow and gives a dry remark about a mistress who cannot keep house without ordering 5 other people to do it for her. The laughter is quick and careful, but real. Gentle sarcasm has a long history. Thank goodness. Oppression like solemn faces. Laughter ruins the performance. Storytelling may begin with a child's question or with no question at all. An elder leans back near the fire and starts talking in the unhurried way of someone who knows the room will come closer if the tale is worth hearing. Some stories carry moral lessons. Some explain animal cunning. Some hold traces of African oral traditions transformed by new landscapes. Some are plainly local now, shaped by Virginia woods, rivers, foxes, storms, and masters with more vanity than sense. You hear the way memory adapts without vanishing. The old world is not fully recoverable, but neither is it gone. A quirky detail from the broader early colonial world reveals how much enslavers misunderstood what stood before them. Some white observers noted singing, dancing, healing practices, or ritual gestures among Africans and treated them as childish amusements or superstitions, as if they were watching curiosities instead of coherent systems of meaning. Their ignorance could be almost comic. A man who cannot imagine another worldview decides that what he does not understand must be nonsense. It is a very durable habit among fools. Healing knowledge carries special weight in these spaces. Plants matter. Roots matter. Leaves, bark, steam, poultices, infusions, and timing all matter. The smell of crushed mint, pennyroyal, or other gathered herbs can fill a cabin with something almost clean and sharp amid smoke and sweat. A sore joint is rubbed, a fever is cooled, a stomach is settled if possible. Knowledge moves from one person to another through practice, not lecture. This kind of care is quiet resistance because it preserves life where the wider system often does not bother to. There are also forms of refusal so small that they might escape a stranger's notice. A look withheld, a silence chosen, a task done without the expected sign of cheerful obedience, a name preserved in private though another is used in public, hair arranged in a way that keeps older meanings close, food seasoned according to remembered taste when ingredients allow, children taught who their people are, even when legal records say otherwise. Resistance need not shout to be real. Sometimes it survives best by lowering its voice. Historians still argue over how much of specific African religious practice can be traced directly in Virginia this early, since records are fragmentary and usually written by outsiders who missed what mattered most. Some scholars stress the loss caused by forced migration and the mixing of many peoples. Others emphasize continuities in music, healing, burial customs, spirit beliefs, and communal forms of worship. The uncertainty is genuine, but uncertainty in the archive does not mean emptiness in life. It often means the most important things were carried where the archive could not reach. Burial and mourning tell you this clearly. Death is never far in a world of hard labour, uncertain food, and disease. When someone dies, grief enters the quarters with a plainness no law can soften. You hear it in the changed tone of the room, lower voices, longer silences, a child asking where someone has gone and receiving an answer too large for any child. People may pray, sing, watch through the night, tend the body, or mark the burial with whatever dignity conditions allow. Even when the grave is simple, the act of mourning is not simple. It says this life mattered. It says the colony's ledgers do not have the last word. In some moments, quiet defiance takes the shape of movement. Feet tapping earth, hands clapping softly, bodies swaying in a circle small enough not to attract unwanted attention. Rhythm does what prose cannot. It binds people together without needing much explanation. You feel it in the chest, in the heel, in the breath shared across the firelight. A person who has been ordered all day may still move in a way that belongs only to the self and the community. That matters. The body remembers freedom in flashes. You also notice the role of older people, especially those who carry fragments others do not. An elder may remember words from another coast, another village, another shore. They may know a tune no one else can fully place. They may keep track of kin ties with astonishing care, naming who belongs to whom, who came with whom, who resembles which grandmother, who must not be forgotten. In a world built to scatter people, memory becomes a form of guardianship. The elder is not simply old. The elder is an archive with a heartbeat. Children absorb all of this while pretending not to listen. They watch who speaks first in prayer. They notice which stories make adults fall silent. They learn that certain songs are for work, others for grief, others for rocking babies towards sleep. They smell herbs before they know their names. They hear when God is addressed as Lord and when a prayer slips into other cadences. No formal school is required for this education. The household and the yard teach it through repetition and presence. One of the clearest forms of quiet resistance is the protection of inner life. You see it when someone stares into the fire not blankly, but inwardly. They are thinking thoughts the master cannot command. Remembering a face, repeating a prayer, planning how to avoid a danger, imagining another place, holding anger in a shape that will not consume them. Interior freedom is not enough by itself, of course. No one should romanticize it. But without it, the external chains would sink deeper. The private mind remains a contested but precious ground. There are moments when Christianity itself becomes something different in black hands than in white mouths. A biblical story about bondage may sound unlike the version heard from the planter. A psalm of deliverance may carry more electricity in the quarters than in the church pew. The same words can live a different life depending on who speaks them and why. That transformation is powerful. It does not erase the hypocrisy of colonists who preach and oppress in the same breath. It simply shows that the oppressed are not passive recipients of doctrine. They reshape what they hear according to the needs of survival and the logic of justice. At times, defiance is so modest it would barely register in a ledger. A hidden keepsake tucked into cloth. A meeting prolonged by a few minutes. A child corrected in private so humiliation does not become public spectacle. A meal shared with someone weaker though food is scarce. A warning passed to a friend before an owner arrives in a foul mood. These acts do not look dramatic from outside. Inside the life, they are everything. They are how dignity is maintained in portions small enough to carry. The night deepens. Crickets begin their patient noise. The air cools against the skin. Firelight paints faces in amber and shadow, making the room look softer than it really is. Someone finishes a story. Someone else adds a line, improving it. A baby finally sleeps. A tired man leans his head back against the wall and closes his eyes while the song continues around him. The atmosphere is not cheerful exactly. It is steadier than that, more grounded. It has the feel of people making meaning together because the alternative would be spiritual starvation. That may be the best way to understand faith and memory here. Not as abstract beliefs floating above hardship, but as nourishment. A way to feed the mind, guard the heart, and insist that the visible order of the plantation is not the deepest order in existence. Masters may control labour and movement. They do not control the whole universe, however much they swagger. Night prayer reminds people of that. Song reminds people of that. Story reminds people of that. The stubborn retention of care, ritual, and communal feeling reminds people of that. By the time the fire burns low, the yard has gone nearly quiet. Only a few voices remain, softer now, with sleep pulling at the edges of every sentence. The smoke smell settles into cloth again. A final prayer may be spoken, brief and intimate. A final glance may pass between two people who have endured another day without surrendering themselves entirely to it. Then bodies lower onto straw, blankets, or bare boards, and the darkness folds around them. Nothing outward has changed. The law is still there. The labour waits for morning. The colony still imagines it can define every useful thing. Yet within the hush of the quarters, another order has been sustained, through prayer, song, healing, humour, memory, and quiet defiance. People have kept alive a sense of worth deeper than the names imposed on them. That hidden work is not small. It is one of the reasons the soul does not vanish, even where power has tried very hard to make it disappear. Morning in Virginia can make even injustice look tidy for an hour or two. You stand near a lane cut through thin spring mud, and the light is soft enough to flatter everything it touches. Fence posts cast narrow shadows. A few chickens scratch beside a yard. Smoke lifts from a chimney in a slow grey ribbon and disappears into the pale sky. The air smells of wet earth, wood smoke, horse sweat, and the clean edge of water somewhere not far off. It would almost feel peaceful if peace were not so carefully rationed here. This is the uneasy world of free black life in 1680. Freedom exists, but it does not spread warmth evenly. It is thin, conditional, and watched with a sort of suspicion usually reserved for a fox in the henhouse. A free black man can wake in his own dwelling, pull on his own clothes, step onto ground he rents or perhaps even owns, and still feel the colony leaning over his shoulder before breakfast. A free black woman can prepare food for her household, tend a garden patch, bargain for goods, and know that one hostile question about her status could turn the whole day cold. Freedom is present, yes. It just never gets to relax. That tension begins with paper, a deed, a manumission record, a parish entry, a contract, a witness statement, a bill of sale showing release. Any scrap that proves status can matter with tremendous force. Paper is fragile. It burns, it mildews, ink fades, mice chew corners. A careless official miscopies a name. A neighbour claims not to remember. And suddenly the thing standing between a person and bondage becomes a vulnerable object folded into cloth and hidden from damp. Imagine building your peace on something that can be ruined by rainwater and rats. That is one of the colony's more elegant cruelties. A mainstream historical fact shapes this whole atmosphere. In late 17th century Virginia, free black people did exist and could in some cases own land, labour for wages, go to court, form households, and participate in local economic life. Yet their legal and social position grew more precarious as racial slavery hardened. Freedom for black people was not steadily expanding here. It was narrowing under pressure from new laws, changing attitudes, and a colony increasingly committed to racial hierarchy. You can see that narrowing in everyday errands. A free black farmer walking to market carries more than produce or tools. He carries proof, caution, and a rehearsed calm. If stopped, he must answer carefully. Too much confidence may read as insolence. Too much hesitation may look suspicious. He learns the delicate art of appearing ordinary in a society that does not want him to be ordinary. It is exhausting work, and the colony offers no wage for it. The market itself is a study in uneasy contact. Barrels, baskets, cured meat, rough cloth, grain, fish, and gossip all change hands beneath the same patch of sky. White settlers come and go with their familiar habits of complaint. Prices are too high, roads are too poor, tobacco is never packed properly unless they packed it themselves. Naturally, amid this daily bustle, a free black seller or buyer must move with extra care. Every exchange contains the possibility of challenge. Not every white customer is hostile, but hostility only needs to appear occasionally to shape the whole atmosphere. You hear it in tone more than words at first. A question asked too sharply. A pause held too long before being addressed as if one truly belongs there. A forced politeness that sits on top of distrust like thin icing over stale cake. The colony is full of these small social signals. They rarely explode all at once, they accumulate. By noon, they can weigh more than a sack of corn. Free black households are often modest, though modesty itself can become dangerous if outsiders mistake hardship for dependence, and dependence for vulnerability. A cabin or small house may stand on a rented patch, or on land acquired through persistence, labour, and remarkable luck. Inside, the rooms are spare but ordered, a bench, a table, bedding rolled and stored, tools hung where they belong, a pot blackened by many meals, herbs drying from the rafters, a Bible, perhaps, if one can be had, a few cups, a chest, a precious paper wrapped and hidden. The smell is familiar and lived in. Cornmeal, smoke, damp wood, sweat, soap if there is any. It is a home built not just against the weather, but against other people's doubts that one deserves a home at all. A quirky feature of colonial society makes this especially maddening. White Virginians could admire a free black person's skill, honesty, or usefulness in one breath, and support restrictions on black freedom in the next. The contradiction does not trouble them nearly as much as it should. A man might say, quite sincerely, that a black neighbour is industrious and respectable, then turn around and insist that black mobility must be controlled for the good of the colony. Human beings are very good at fitting hypocrisy into their boots and walking around in it. Work for free. Black people varies widely. Some labour as tenant farmers, hired hands, craftsmen, boatmen, or domestic workers. A man with skill in carpentry or cooperage may be valued for his hands and distrusted for his independence at the exact same time. A woman may wash clothes, sell produce, brew, spin, nurse, or hire herself out in ways that keep a household afloat. What matters most is that free status does not erase hard labour. It changes who claims the direct right to command it, but it does not grant ease. The body still bears the colony's demands. The difference is that the wages, the crop, or the small earnings may belong more directly to the worker or household, though never beyond risk. Risk is everywhere in neighbourly relations. A free black family lives among white families whose opinions can become practical danger. A petty dispute over a pig, a fence line, a debt, a trespass, or a missing tool can quickly become something larger when race enters the argument. Suddenly the issue is not just the pig or the fence. It is whether a black person may stand firm in a disagreement without being accused of insolence. It is whether white testimony will outweigh black proof. It is whether local authority wants peace or merely the comfort of white superiority. Historians still debate how far social integration extended for free black people in certain parts of 17th century Virginia, especially in communities where labour needs and sparse populations created more fluid daily contact. Some evidence suggests practical cooperation, shared work zones, and occasional legal recognition of black property or family ties. Other evidence shows increasing boundaries and harsher racial sorting. The uncertainty comes partly from the patchy record and partly from the fact that daily life could be contradictory. A person might be useful, known, and still never truly accepted. Children in free black household grow up inside that contradiction. They may have more room to move than enslaved children, more claim to kin, and perhaps more direct guidance from parents over the shape of the day. Yet they learn early that freedom does not mean safety. A mother teaches a child to answer clearly when questioned. A father warns against wandering too far without reason. Older children may be sent on errands with strict instructions about papers, manners, and routes. The lesson is constant. You are free, but do not give the colony an excuse to forget it. The church offers little simplicity either. A free black person may be baptized, may attend worship, may know the scriptures well, and still find that spiritual fellowship stops short of social equality. The bell rings for all ears, but the pews do not dissolve hierarchy by magic. Still, churches and parish records can matter greatly, because baptismal entries, marriages noted by clergy, or other official traces may help establish identity and status. It is one of those peculiar colonial arrangements in which a soul can be welcomed while the body remains carefully ranked. You can smell the tension even in public gatherings, sweat under Sunday wool, dust from the road, tallow, breath held a little too long when a question is asked. A free black man removes his hat, stands straight, and speaks with measured calm. He knows that presentation matters, perhaps unfairly more for him than for anyone around him. Respectability becomes a kind of armour, though it is armour made of cloth and posture, and thus never quite enough. Land ownership, where it occurs, changes the texture of life in important ways. To plant on your own plot, however small, is to feel time differently. Seeds are not only a duty, they are a claim. A fence repaired by your hand protects more than crop. It protects a statement that you belong in the landscape in more than a passing way. Yet black landholding unsettles white Virginians precisely because it makes freedom visible. A free black household rooted to land is harder to dismiss as temporary or exceptional, and the colony, increasingly, prefers black freedom to remain exceptional. There is something almost comical in how anxious white lawmakers become about exceptions. A few free black people owning land or moving with relative independence can seem to inspire legislative worry far beyond their numbers. That worry is revealing. It suggests that racial hierarchy is less secure than its defenders claim. If they were truly confident in their order, they would not spend so much energy policing the edges of it. Fragile systems are always the most dramatic. For free black women, the uncertainty can be especially sharp. Gender never appears alone here. It arrives tangled with race, labour, sexuality, and household responsibility. A free black woman may head a household, bargain in the market, protect children, pursue debts, or seek legal recognition of property, all while facing the constant danger that white men or women may treat her independence as improper. Her competence does not shield her. In some ways it makes her more visible, and visibility is risky when the social order resents your existence. Marriage and kinship among free black people can be more stable than under slavery, but stability is always relative. A husband may be free while a wife is not, or the reverse. Children's futures can be shaped by the legal status of the mother. Extended kin networks matter tremendously because they provide labour sharing, child care, emotional support, and witnesses when proof is needed. A relative who can testify to a birth, a baptism, a manumission, or a long-known identity may become as valuable as any piece of paper. Family memory becomes a legal tool as well as a source of comfort. There are moments of ordinary pride too, and they deserve notice. A neatly swept yard, a successful harvest from a small patch, a pair of shoes repaired rather than replaced, a child learning letters, a roof patched before the rains. The colony may view black freedom with suspicion, but within the household such achievements carry quiet satisfaction. They are proof that life is being built, not merely endured. You see this clearly in the evening when work slows. A free black family gathers around a meal, perhaps no richer than anyone else's in material terms, yet touched by a different feeling. The food belongs more fully to the household that made it. The timing of supper, though constrained by labour and daylight, is not dictated by a master's immediate command. Conversation settles differently. Someone discusses the crop, someone else mentions a debt to collect or a tool to mend. A child asks a question and receives an answer from a parent whose authority is not entirely borrowed from another household. These are modest freedoms. They matter profoundly, and yet none of them cancel the larger unease. Night can bring knocks at the door, papers may need to be shown, patrols or neighbours may question movement. Rumours about new laws drift through the colony, making their way from court to tavern to lane to cabin. Free black people learn to listen carefully when white men begin sentences with concern for public order. Public order usually turns out to mean someone else's restrictions. The atmosphere of narrowing freedom can almost be touched. It is in the stiffness of a greeting, in the way a document is unfolded with careful hands, in the quick glance a mother gives when her son returns later than expected, in the decision to avoid certain roads after dusk, in the little chest where valuable papers are stored above ground and away from damp, in the dry mouth before entering a courthouse or market, in the relief of getting home unchallenged and latching the door. This is not the drama of chains clanking in obvious view. It is subtler than that, and for that reason easy to miss if you only study laws from far away. But from inside the life, the pressure is unmistakable. Freedom is real enough to defend and fragile enough to fear losing. It asks for constant maintenance, constant proof, constant attention to mood, language, paper, and place. As darkness settles over the lane and the sounds of the day soften to insects, distant barking, and the last clatter of a bucket set down, you understand the peculiar ache of this existence. A free black person in 1680 Virginia can build a household, work for personal gain, worship, marry, parent, and move through the colony with some lawful claim to self. Yet every one of those ordinary human acts is hemmed in by suspicion. The space of freedom is there, but it is narrowing like a road through marshland, firm enough to walk for now, treacherous at the edges, and watched by a society increasingly determined to decide that black autonomy is something it can tolerate only in small, anxious doses. The law reaches into the cradle long before a child can speak. You feel it in the stillness of early morning, when the yard is quiet except for a rooster somewhere beyond the trees, and the soft hiss of a fire coaxed back to life. Mist hangs low over the ground. The air is cool and damp, smelling of ash, wet soil, old wood, and the faint sourness of clothes dried too slowly. Inside the cabin, a baby stirs with that small, uncertain rustle babies make before crying. A mother wakes instantly. Her body has learned to listen even in sleep. This is where the colony shows one of its darkest talents, not simply in commanding labour from grown bodies, but in turning birth itself into property logic. A woman holds an infant to her chest, feeling warmth, weight, and the tiny searching movements of a hungry mouth, while beyond the wall the legal order has already begun counting what the child may someday be worth. Nothing reveals the cold ambition of slavery more clearly than this. The system does not wait for adulthood. It plants itself in family life from the very first breath. One major historical fact shapes the entire atmosphere. By this period in Virginia, the legal status of a child followed the status of the mother. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved. This principle gave slaveholders a powerful incentive to treat black women's fertility as a source of future wealth. The law did not merely tolerate hereditary slavery, it organized it. It made the womb part of the labor system. The cruelty of that rule settles over ordinary moments. A mother feeding her child is never only feeding a child in the eyes of the owner. She may also be nursing future labor. A planter looking over a household inventory can see not just present workers, but potential generations. A little boy learning to walk, a little girl tied to her mother's skirt, to the family. These are beloved children, to the master class. They can become future field hands, house servants, saleable assets, and entries in a ledger not yet written. The legal imagination of the colony is grimly efficient. You notice how women carry this knowledge in the body. An older woman rocking a newborn has tenderness in her hands and worry behind her eyes. A younger mother watches the door even while soothing a child. Pregnancy is not a private journey here. It is observed, discussed, and sometimes managed by others with interests very different from the mother's own. A white mistress may comment on the timing. A master may calculate future value. Other enslaved women may offer practical help, advice, and deep sympathy, because they understand better than anyone the uneasy mixture of joy and dread that can greet a birth under slavery. The cabin holds the familiar signs of domestic life. Rough bedding, a pot near the hearth, cloths drying on a peg, a small bundle of treasured things tucked away from damp. The room smells of smoke, milk, sweat, herbs, and the sweet warm scent that clings to infants. It is an intimate space, yet not a secure one. Even here, motherhood unfolds under watch. Black women in 1680 often laboured hard during pregnancy, and returned to work quickly after childbirth, depending on the owner, the season, and the demands of the property. The body was expected to perform two kinds of labour at once: productive labour in the fields or house, and reproductive labour for the system itself. The colony may not have spoken in those terms, but it understood the advantage perfectly well. It wanted women's work, children's future work, and the legal framework to make both profitable. There is something especially bitter in how calmly this can be discussed by those in power. A planter might speak of an enslaved woman as strong, healthy, and likely to bear children, with the tone one uses for livestock breeding or orchard prospects. The sentence may be polished, almost casual. That calmness is its own offence. It shows how thoroughly exploitation has entered everyday thinking. When monstrous ideas become routine speech, a society is in very bad shape. However politely it eats supper, birth itself is precarious in this world. There are no gleaming clinics, no dependable safety nets, no broad mercy from those who own the labouring body. Women rely on one another, on experienced elders, on herbal knowledge, on prayers, on luck, and on endurance. The sounds of labour fill a cabin differently from any other sounds. Short breaths, a moan swallowed and reshaped, urgent whispers, water heating, cloth wrung out, a baby finally crying into the smoky air. Relief arrives, but often it is braided with fear. Will the child live? Will the mother recover? What demands will return, and how soon? One quirky but revealing detail from colonial society is how much white households depended on black women's expertise in childbirth, nursing, and childcare, while still denying those women authority over their own family lives. A mistress might trust an enslaved woman to calm a feverish white infant, prepare remedies, or manage children skillfully. Yet that same enslaved woman could be separated from her own child by sale or work assignment. The contradiction is almost insulting in its boldness. Use the knowledge, ignore the humanity. Colonial logic in a nutshell. Children's early years are shaped by labour expectations from the start. Infants must be kept alive in cramped conditions. Toddlers are watched by older siblings or elderly relatives while adults work. Small children begin with minor tasks as soon as they are physically able: carrying, fetching, minding, sorting, holding. The law has already declared their status. The household slowly discovers what that status will demand of the body. Childhood exists, but the colony shortens it whenever useful. For mothers, this can produce a deep and exhausting tension. You must teach a child how to survive within the system while trying not to surrender the child entirely to it. That means practical lessons. Stay near. Speak carefully. Do not wander where you should not. Listen when warned. Learn names. Learn faces. Learn who can be trusted. It also means emotional work that leaves no record. How do you comfort a child you cannot fully protect? How do you love openly in a world prepared to weaponize that love against you? The answer often is fiercely. You see it in ordinary gestures, a mother saving the softest bit of food for a small mouth, a father carving a toy from scrap wood despite his own fatigue, a grandmother telling stories that place the child inside a lineage larger than the plantation, a sibling carrying another child on a hip with more patience than anyone that age should have to develop. Family life under these conditions is pressured, certainly, but it is not weak. It can be remarkably strong precisely because it must be. Historians still debate the degree to which slaveholders in 17th century Virginia had fully developed later plantation-era breeding logics, since the scale and organization of slavery was still evolving. Some scholars emphasize that planters were already alert to the value of hereditary status and future labor. Others caution against projecting later, more systematized practices too neatly backward. The uncertainty matters, but it does not soften the core truth. The law had already made black motherhood economically useful to enslavers in a deeply structural way, whether or not every owner expressed it with the same cold calculation. A father's position in this world is painful in a different register. He may love, guide, teach, and defend his children as fully as any man, yet the law does not reliably grant him secure authority over them if they are enslaved. He cannot assume that his family bond will be recognized when ownership interests intervene. This does not make fatherhood unreal, it makes it vulnerable. A father may fix a roof, discipline a child, bring food, and whisper advice at night while knowing that none of these acts guarantee the law will treat him as more than an attachment to someone else's property. That legal fragility reaches into inheritance too. White families inherit land, tools, livestock, and people. Black families risk inheriting separation. A planter dies, and an estate is settled. On paper, this may look orderly. Goods are listed, debts tallied, property divided. But if human beings are included in that property, then settlement becomes scattering. A mother can be assigned to one heir, a child to another, a husband to a third. The law calls this administration. The household experiences it as rupture. You can almost hear the cruelty in the scratch of the quill. An inventory clerk writes down names, ages, approximate values, and relationships only when useful to the transfer. The room may smell of ink, candle wax, damp coats, and old wood. Men discuss fairness among heirs. Fairness, in this setting, means fairness to white claimants, not to the people whose lives are being cut into shares. The legal fiction of property pushes straight through the centre of kinship. It turns family into an estate problem. Yet kinship keeps asserting itself. Aunties, uncles, cousins, grandmothers, fictive kin, nursing mothers, all build webs of care that do not depend on legal approval. One woman may nurse another's child if needed. An older boy may guard a younger one with stern devotion. A grandmother may hold the names of relatives across several plantations and repeat them until children know them by heart. These ties matter because the colony's categories are not enough to sustain life. People create broader forms of belonging to strengthen what the law weakens. The sensory world of motherhood and childhood remains vivid even under this pressure. A baby's warm cheek against a shoulder, the smell of lye soap on freshly washed cloth, the roughness of a child's little hand, dusty from playing in the yard, the sound of a hiccup in tears after a fall, the drowsy weight of a sleeping toddler at dusk. These intimate textures are part of the history too. Without them, you only see the law and miss the lives that law tried to dominate. There is also a sharpened awareness among women of one another's circumstances. A pregnancy may be met with congratulations, concern, or both. An older woman may quietly assess whether the mother is getting enough food, enough rest, enough help. Advice passes in low tones. Which herbs soothe cramping? Which foods strengthen milk? How to keep a child quieter when the yard is tense? Knowledge is communal because danger is communal. One mother's burden rarely belongs only to her. At times, children become the carriers of memory. They repeat songs learned from elders. They remember who visited, who vanished, who called them by which name. A child may ask questions adults cannot answer honestly without pain. Where is uncle? Why does grandmother cry at night sometimes? Why can I not go with you? Such questions expose the strain of living in families whose emotional truths are deeper than their legal recognition. Adults answer as best they can, often with a mixture of honesty, protection, and silence. One of the saddest colonial habits is how often white society treated black children as both dependent and already marked for labour. A white observer might comment on a child's playfulness one minute and on future usefulness the next, without sensing any contradiction. This moral numbness is part of how slavery sustains itself. It trains adults to look at childhood and see a work schedule approaching. But children themselves remain gloriously imperfect subjects of such control. They laugh, they squabble, they daydream, they cling to favourite people, they resist sleep, they make games from scraps, they ask inconvenient questions, they cry when frightened and recover with astonishing speed. The system can assign status, but it cannot fully erase the unpredictability of childhood. In that unpredictability there is some hope, however fragile. Life does not always follow the lines power draws for it. As evening settles over the yard, mothers gather children close, checking faces, hands, and moods. A bowl is passed, a scrape is cleaned, a baby is rocked, a stern word is given to an older child who wandered too far. A song may be hummed without much thought, simply because rhythm helps a restless infant settle. The sky darkens. Smoke thickens in the cooling air. Somewhere beyond the cabins, a dog barks twice and stops. The household tightens around itself. In these hours, the law still exists. Of course. It remains ugly and active, waiting in deeds, statutes, wills, inventories, and the calculations of owners. Yet inside the cabin, another order pushes back. Mothers claim children with touch and voice. Fathers claim them with instruction and protection. Elders claim them with memory. Siblings claim them with loyalty and exasperated care. The colony may insist that status follows the mother. The family replies, in 100 daily ways, that belonging runs deeper than law. That reply does not cancel danger. Nothing here cancels danger, but it does reveal something essential. Slavery tries to turn birth into bookkeeping, inheritance into division, and motherhood into production. Black families answer by making children into loved persons, by surrounding infants with names and stories, by teaching the young not only how to survive but who they are. In a system obsessed with ownership, that insistence on kinship is more than sentiment. It is one of the most powerful human refusals in the colony, spoken not in courts, but in cabins, with tired hands, careful voices, and children held close against the night. The rumours usually arrive before sunrise, not by magic, of course, though the colony does love to behave as if whispers travel through pine trees on their own. They come by Wagon Road, by riverside talk, by a mutter near the smokehouse, by a white man lowering his voice at the tavern and raising it again for effect. You wake to a morning that smells of wet leaves, wood smoke, and the faint sourness of yesterday's mash, and before the fire has even settled into a steady burn, someone is already saying that trouble is brewing somewhere. Trouble. It is a wonderfully flexible word when used by people in power. It can mean danger, inconvenience, disobedience, or simply the unsettling fact that oppressed people have thoughts. In 1680, Virginia, fear moves fast. The colony fears rebellion, escape, theft, gatherings, weapons, and anything it cannot fully predict. Yet much of this fear is self-inflicted. A society that builds itself on forced labour then spends its evenings worrying that the labourers may object. Astonishing. You almost want to congratulate them for noticing the obvious. Only a few decades late, white anxiety becomes one of the great background sounds of the place, always humming behind church bells, market chatter, and legal pronouncements. It turns every rumour into evidence and every independent black action into a possible plot. For black Americans living under new slave laws, resistance takes many forms, and not all of them look dramatic from the outside. Some are quiet enough to pass unnoticed by anyone not living inside the system. A tool misplaced, a work rhythm slowed, food saved secretly, a path memorized through woods and marsh, a message passed in ordinary language that means more than it seems, a meeting framed as one thing while serving another, a refusal to break inwardly, even when the body is forced to yield outwardly. Resistance does not need a trumpet. Sometimes it survives best dressed as routine. One historical fact sits at the centre of this tension. Colonial lawmakers in Virginia tightened restrictions in 1680, partly because they feared the mobility, self-defence, and potential collective action of enslaved black people. Laws limiting weapons, movement, and assembly did not emerge from idle theory. They reflected white concern that enslaved people might resist, flee, or organise. The fear itself is evidence. Power would not harden so anxiously if it felt entirely secure. You can feel that anxiety at dusk, when the plantation settles into its uncertain evening. The field noises fade, tools are stacked. The smell of cut leaf gives way to smoke, earth, and supper fires. Shadows lengthen between the cabins. This is the hour when talk lowers and sharpens. Not always into plans. Sometimes only into warnings. Who has been asking questions? Which road patrols have passed more often? Which owner is drinking heavily? Which neighbouring plantation has seen a runaway attempt? Information itself becomes a survival tool. The person who listens well may live more safely than the person who speaks boldly. Runaways haunt the imagination of the colony, not only successful ones, though those trouble masters most. Even the attempt matters. A person missing at dawn can throw a household into panic. Horses are saddled, dogs may be used, neighbours are alerted, descriptions are shouted or written. A supposed servant or slave who has vanished becomes a moving challenge to the whole logic of ownership. That is why white men react so personally. The escape is not merely loss of labour, it is an insult to their claim of control. For the person fleeing, the world narrows into sensation, mud pulling at the feet, mosquitoes whining in the dark, bark scraping the hands, river water shock cold around the calves, hunger sharpening every smell from distant cooking fires. The body learns fear in pulses. Listen. Move. Freeze. Listen again. Some fugitives seek nearby kin or friends. Some aim for ships. Some try to vanish into woods or swamps. Some make desperate, temporary runs simply to punish an owner with inconvenience, to breathe outside command for one night, or to force a renegotiation of treatment. Not every escape attempt is a grand bid for permanent freedom. Sometimes it is a declaration that the body will not submit quietly every single day. Small sabotage can be just as meaningful. A hoe handle cracks at a useful moment. A task takes longer than expected. A pig slips loose from a pen. A message is delayed. A horse is not quite where it should be. Tobacco is handled with less loving care than the planter imagines his precious leaves deserve. These acts do not overturn the system. They do, however, force the system to spend energy on enforcement. Slavery depends on discipline, repetition, and predictable output. Anything that frays predictability has power. Naturally, white colonists often respond as if they are the true victims in the story. One hears complaints in the tavern. Servants are insolent. Negroes are unruly. The county is unsafe. The times are unsettled. It is a marvellous performance. Men who command other people's labour from dawn to nightfall, then gather over drink to discuss the burden of being inconvenienced by human resistance. The ale probably tastes extra self-righteous. A quirky detail from colonial records and commentary is how often white observers transformed everyday black sociability into something sinister. A few people talking after dark could become suspicious assembly. Carrying a stick or tool could look like armed threat. Ordinary movement between plantations could be recast as plotting. This tells you something important. White panic often exaggerated danger, because the social order trained whites to interpret black independence as menace. Fear was not only about actual conspiracies, it was also about guilty imagination. That does not mean larger forms of resistance were absent. People did coordinate sometimes, plans were whispered, routes discussed, opportunities weighed, a boat left untied, a door left unlatched, a warning given before patrols arrived. Collective action in such conditions is dangerous precisely because surveillance is strong and punishments are harsh. Trust becomes precious and difficult. Whom do you tell? How much do you tell them? Has someone been pressured into informing? Does desperation make a person brave or reckless? There are no clean answers. Historians still argue over how organized resistance was in Virginia at this early stage compared with later centuries, when plantation systems became larger and records of conspiracies more frequent. Some scholars stress everyday resistance over coordinated revolt in the 17th century. Others note that white fears of uprising were already significant and not entirely invented. The evidence can be thin because failed plans often vanished from the record and surviving records were written by frightened or self-interested colonists. What seems clear is that the potential for organized resistance haunted white minds, even when proof was uncertain. Women play vital roles in this atmosphere, though colonial accounts often overlook them. A woman may pass news under the cover of domestic work. She may hide food for someone planning to flee. She may observe the moods of the big house and report which nights are most dangerous. She may protect children by steering them away from risky talk. She may also resist through endurance, silence, and refusal to provide the emotional submission the system desires. White men often imagine resistance in masculine terms, weapons and open confrontation, because it fits their dramatic fantasies. Real resistance is broader, quieter, and often organized through women's labor and perception. Children hear more than adults realize. A boy pretending to play with a stick near the yard may absorb names, routes, warnings, and tones of urgency. A girl sent to fetch water may notice who slips behind the smokehouse and who returns too quickly from the lane. Children are rarely central planners, but they live inside the climate of fear and courage. They learn which words mean danger even when not explained. They learn that adults sometimes stop speaking when certain footsteps approach. They learn that some silences are heavier than others. The woods themselves become characters in this story. Thick growth, insects, mud, birds startled into flight, hidden paths, brambles catching cloth, the smell of pine, rot, and standing water. For a runaway, the woods can feel like both refuge and trap. For the masterclass, they're a maddening zone beyond neat supervision. Nature does not respect property lines as obediently as planters would like. The forest keeps secrets, though not always kindly. It shelters bodies while offering snakes, thorns, cold nights, and hunger in return. You begin to understand why rumour thrives here. Everyone knows enough to fear, and too little to feel sure. White planters hear of a missing tool and imagine insurrection. Enslaved people hear of a new patrol and imagine fresh cruelty. A scrap of information grows as it moves. By the time it reaches the far end of a county, a small event may have become a grand tale full of armed men, hidden meetings, and narrow escapes. Rumour is not merely falsehood, it is a map of collective nerves. Sometimes the rumour itself becomes a weapon, White officials may spread stories of impending crackdowns to discourage movement. Planters may exaggerate punishments to terrify others into obedience. Enslaved people may pass confusing or partial information to misdirect attention. In a world where power depends on knowledge, controlling what people think they know can matter almost as much as controlling their bodies. A whispered lie told at the right moment may buy real time. There is also spiritual resistance in these hours of tension. Prayer before an escape, a blessing whispered over someone heading into the woods, a song sung softly to steady fear. These are not decorative extras. They are technologies of courage, when the body shakes and the future narrows to a dark path through marsh grass. A remembered line, a rhythm, or a blessing can hold the mind together. Historians do not always have good records for such moments, because courage rarely submits written testimony. Yet it is there in the logic of survival. Punishment hangs over all of this like bad weather. The colony answers resistance with force because it has little else to offer. Whippings, confinement, branding in some places and times, sale, separation, public examples meant to frighten others, all form part of the disciplinary world, even when a particular plantation uses less formal spectacle. The threat remains understood. That threat shapes every decision. A person considering flight is not choosing between danger and safety. They are choosing between different dangers, one familiar and grinding, the other immediate and uncertain. A master discovering resistance rarely interprets it with humility. He does not conclude that coercion has morally corrupted his household. He concludes that more coercion is needed. Such men can turn almost comically predictable. They tighten rules, watch more closely, demand reports, limit gatherings, and punish broadly when they cannot identify the right target. Collective punishment reveals weakness masquerading as strength. If you truly command loyalty, you do not need to terrorize everyone after a single incident. But slavery has no loyalty to draw upon. It has only fear, habit, and the temporary obedience fear can produce. By late evening, the plantation can feel suspended. The air cools, crickets pulse in the grass, firelight flickers low, a patrol may pass on the road, hooves soft at first, then sharp on harder ground. People inside the cabins lie still and listen. Is this routine? Is someone being sought? Has a rumour already become a search? The body learns to read sound with astonishing precision. A horse moving on, boots stopping, a voice too close, a dog catching scent. Night magnifies everything, and yet resistance remains stubbornly alive because the human urge to push against domination is stubbornly alive. Some people resist by fleeing, some by praying and enduring, some by preserving loved ones, some by damaging output, some by withholding the signs of cheerful submission the master craves, some by sharing knowledge, some by maintaining a self the system cannot fully colonize. None of these acts alone is enough. Together, they form a landscape of refusal. White panic, for all its noise, cannot erase that landscape. It can only reveal how much the colony fears what it has made. Every rumour of conspiracy, every law against gathering, every patrol in the dusk, every complaint in the tavern points to the same truth. The system knows it is unnatural. Deep down, even its beneficiaries know this. If slavery were truly stable and righteous, it would not need such constant vigilance. The endless fear is a confession. The night deepens, smoke thins. A baby fusses briefly, then quiets, somewhere far off. Perhaps across a river or a stand of trees, a dog barks and is answered by another. The world feels vast and close at once. In one cabin, someone considers a path through the woods. In another, someone decides to wait. In another, a woman passes a warning with her eyes alone. No ledger will capture all this. No magistrate will hear the full testimony of it. Yet the colony is shaped by these hidden choices as surely as by any law. That is the strange heartbeat of 1680. Virginia. Publicly, this slave system presents itself as order, Privately, it trembles with fear, refusal, improvisation, and rumour. Black Americans live inside that trembling with immense caution and courage, making decisions in shadows, balancing hope against punishment, and proving day after day that even under tightening laws, domination is never complete. The powerful can command labour, seize bodies, and spread terror. They still cannot make the longing to resist disappear. It walks the lanes, waits in the woods, hides in whispers, and keeps the whole colony awake. The future is already in the room, even if no one says its name aloud. You feel it on a cool evening when the light is thinned to grey and the yard seems to hold its breath. Smoke from the cabins drifts low across the ground. The air smells of ash, damp wood, boiled corn, and the faint metallic edge of river mist moving inland. A cartwheel somewhere gives a tired squeal, then falls quiet. A child is called inside. A dog noses through the dust and settles near a doorway. Nothing looks dramatic. That is how large changes often arrive. Not with thunder, with habits, with paperwork, with ordinary people deciding that cruelty shall be made more systematic tomorrow than it was today. In 1680, Virginia stands at such a threshold. The colony is no longer merely improvising with forced labour and uneven custom. It is learning to build a more durable racial order, one that will not rely only on individual masters being harsh or local courts being inclined toward prejudice. It is moving toward a society in which race, bondage, inheritance, punishment, and public order fit together more tightly, like boards fastened into a wall. What makes this moment so chilling is that many of the people constructing that wall think of themselves as practical. They are not composing grand theories by candlelight. They are solving what they call problems, labour shortages, property disputes, fears of unrest, questions of status. The result is not accidental, it is assembled. One major historical fact gives this moment its heavy weight. By the later 17th century, Virginia was solidifying hereditary racial slavery through law, custom, and economic practice, creating foundations that would shape the lives of Black Americans for generations. The statutes of these years did not finish the system in one stroke, but they helped make it more coherent, more permanent, and more deeply embedded in everyday life. The colony was not drifting into slavery by mistake. It was choosing it, clause by clause. You can see that choice in the texture of ordinary scenes. A planter reviewing accounts no longer sees only present labour. He sees offspring, years, transfer value, control. A magistrate discussing discipline no longer treats violence as an awkward exception. He begins to treat it as governance. A poor white labourer learns to measure his worth not only against wealth above him, but against black people forced below him. A white child watching all this grows up assuming hierarchy is part of the weather. That is how systems deepen. They enter the common sense of a place. The sounds of the colony tell the story too. Quill scratching in court, hooves on the lane at night, orders called across a field, church bells summoning souls into a moral universe that somehow leaves room for human ownership, hammer striking timber as houses, fences and outbuildings spread across occupied land, dogs barking at movement in the dark, babies crying in cabins where the law has already assigned them a status. These are not separate noises. Together they form the soundtrack of a world tightening around black life. What is becoming tighter is not only labour but possibility. For Black Americans, whether enslaved or free, the range of imaginable futures is narrowing under colonial law. An enslaved child has fewer openings than an African-born person might have found earlier in the century, when status could in some cases still be contested or negotiated under messy conditions. A free black adult may still work, own, marry, worship, and move with some lawful standing, but the atmosphere around that freedom grows more suspicious. The colony is trying to eliminate ambiguity, And when a racial order eliminates ambiguity, it usually means freedom is being squeezed, not expanded. There is something darkly absurd in how calmly this process presents itself. Men speak of stability, as if stability were always a virtue. They speak of order, as if any arrangement maintained by violence deserves that lovely tidy word. They speak of protecting the colony, though much of what they are protecting is their own ability to extract labour without interruption. One is tempted to hand them a mirror and a dictionary at the same time. Still, self-deception is often one of history's most efficient tools. People who think they are being reasonable can do extraordinary harm before supper. A curious detail from the period reveals how fragile the system remains even while it hardens. White colonists continue to worry obsessively about movement, gatherings, and contact across plantations because they know the order they are building depends on constant enforcement. Truly confident societies do not spend so much time fearing conversations in the dark. The nervous energy of lawmakers is almost comic in its intensity. Almost. But fear backed by law is not funny for those who must live beneath it. The plantation economy itself presses this future forward. Tobacco drains soil and consumes labour. It rewards scale, discipline, and dependable exploitation. If profit is the colony's pulse, then labour control is its nervous system. A workforce held for life and reproduced by law appears to planters as a grimly elegant solution. No need to bargain every term, no need to release workers after contracts expire, no need to pretend that labourers possess claims equal to your own. The appeal is brutally clear, and once wealth begins to rely on such clarity, conscience tends to become remarkably flexible. Historians still debate the exact balance between economic calculation and racial ideology in driving Virginia's transformation at this stage. Some emphasize labour needs, land expansion, and the aftermath of political instability among white colonists. Others stress the rapid hardening of anti-black ideas into a worldview that shaped law far beyond immediate labour concerns. The debate is worthwhile, but from inside the lived experience the distinction may feel thinner than scholars wish. The hand that profits and the mind that ranks by race quickly learn to work together. You feel the future in the social fabric of the colony. White women in planter households inherit and manage people as property through marriage, widowhood, or estate settlement, helping normalise the system within domestic life. Ministers preach obedience in ways that can soothe white consciences more than troubled souls. County officials record black lives in inventories or wills, tax lists, and court cases, slowly teaching administration to think racially. Young white boys observe their fathers command black adults and absorb an education in authority before they ever hold legal power themselves. Young white girls learn household mastery in a world where black women's labour supports white comfort. The system is not sustained by one class of men alone. It spreads through family, church, market, and law. For black families, the future tightening means living with greater pressure not simply to endure, but to preserve personhood under conditions designed to reduce it. The ordinary acts that keep people human become even more important. Naming a child with care, passing on memory, protecting scraps of proof, teaching caution without extinguishing spirit, sharing food, hiding tenderness where necessary and showing it where possible. These actions are not sentimental extras. They are defences against a world becoming more efficient at categorising black life as exploitable. The land itself seems to feel this change. If land can feel anything, Virginia is a place of rivers, marshes, low woods, fields hacked from older ecologies, and roads that are often less roads than stubborn suggestions through mud. Morning mists rise over water that carried ships, goods, and people into this system. Forest edges conceal both refuge and danger. Tobacco rows mark profit onto the landscape. Fences divide what was taken and then claimed. The colony's physical environment is not passive scenery. It has been made to serve the emerging order, even as it continues to offer concealment, root, and resistance in its swamps, creeks, and tree lines. There is another threshold hidden in plain sight. 1680 sits only a short distance before even harsher legislation in Virginia, including the 1705 slave code that would consolidate many earlier practices and statutes into a fuller legal architecture of racial slavery. The people living now do not know that code by name yet, but they inhabit the approach to it. They are standing in the wet clay from which it will be formed. The later structure does not descend from the sky. It grows from choices already being made in fields, courts, and households. That is what makes this year so important. It is ordinary enough to hide its significance. No parade announces the triumph of a racial order. No trumpet sounds to mark the moment when a society decides that blackness will be tied more firmly to inherited bondage. Instead, the change appears in accumulations. A law here, a custom there, a local decision, a church accommodation, a fearful patrol, an estate division, a child born under one status rather than another. The colony trains itself through repetition. Soon what was once debated becomes assumed. What was once defended awkwardly becomes defended as tradition. Human beings can become frighteningly comfortable with evil when it's distributed across routine. For free black people, the tightening future suggests a cruel lesson. Even lawful freedom may not protect against a society increasingly determined to make race itself a mark of civic suspicion. Property can be challenged. Testimony can be discounted. Movement can be questioned. Ordinary prosperity can provoke resentment rather than respect. The colony is moving toward a world in which black success will not soften white hierarchy, but may instead make it more anxious. Exceptions are tolerated only while they remain small and manageable. For enslaved people, the future threatens deeper permanence. The law's gaze will reach more thoroughly into movement, assembly, punishment, labour, family, and inheritance. Masters will claim not only work, but the right to shape generations. Children will grow into a system already prepared for them. Mothers and fathers will love under sharper legal vulnerability. Resistance will continue. Certainly, because resistance always continues. But the mechanisms arrayed against it will grow more elaborate. Even white society pays a price for this tightening, though it rarely admits it. A colony organized around domination teaches cruelty as a habit. It narrows the moral imagination of those who benefit from it. It makes fear ordinary. It invites hypocrisy into church and home. It persuades poor whites to accept shallow racial privileges in place of deeper justice. It trains elites to see human beings as capital. These are corruptions of character as much as structures of economy. The colony may grow richer in tobacco and land claims, but it grows poorer in honesty. The evening air cools further now. Crickets begin their patient scraping in the grass. The smoke above the cabins thins as the fires settle. In one yard, someone folds a cloth with tired hands. In another, a child leans sleepily against an elder's side. Somewhere on the road, hooves pass and fade. The whole colony seems suspended between quiet and vigilance. That feeling is the threshold itself. Nothing is finished, yet much has already been decided. A final quirky truth lingers here. Human beings are wonderfully talented at calling a newly invented system ancient if it benefits them. Give a few years to a fresh injustice, and someone will start speaking of custom, tradition, and the natural way of things. Virginia is already moving in that direction. What is being made through law and profit will soon be defended as if it had always existed. One almost admires the speed of the fiction. Almost, yet the future is not built only by the powerful. Black Americans also shape what comes next. Not by drafting statutes or owning counties, but by surviving, remembering, resisting, creating kin, preserving knowledge, and refusing to let the colony define the whole meaning of their lives. Every prayer murmured over a child, every hidden path learned through the woods, every song carried into another generation, every household held together under pressure, Every act of care or refusal contributes to a different inheritance. The legal order may harden, but it never fully conquers the interior world, the communal world, or the stubborn human capacity to insist that one is more than what the law says. That is why this threshold matters so much. The colony is creating a harsher future. Yes, but within that future, black life will continue to generate family, culture, memory, intelligence, labour, endurance, and resistance beyond the narrow purposes assigned by masters and magistrates. Power can tighten. It cannot become total in the way it dreams. Now the night deepens, and with it comes a softer kind of seeing. The outlines of fences and roofs blur. Smoke dissolves into the dark. The road loses its edges. The world grows quieter, not because danger has vanished, but because sleep must come even to troubled places. You let the sounds drift farther away. A last murmur from a cabin, a far-off splash in the river, the settling creak of timber cooling after the day. The colony, so busy with laws and ledgers, begins to soften at the edges under the dark. You breathe in the cool air and let the details loosen. The tobacco fields are only shadows now, broad and still under the sky. The courthouse is silent. The landing by the river rests between tides. Cabins hold embers glowing low, like little red stars near the ground. The people within them, weary and watchful and deeply human, draw blankets close, settle children, and close their eyes for a few precious hours. Beyond them, trees stand black against the night, and above them the sky opens wider than any law. The arguments of lawmakers fade first. The proud voices of planters fade next. The clink of tools, the call of orders, the scratching quill, all grow dim. What remains is the gentler rhythm underneath history. Breath in the dark, fire sinking to ash, wind moving through leaves, water touching the bank and drawing back again. You do not need to hold every date or statute now. You only need to feel the stillness around the lives that endured them. So let the scene grow quiet. Let the roads empty. Let the smoke rise and disappear. Let the cabins sink into rest. Let the river carry away the sharp edges of the day. The colony will wake again to its labours and fears, but for this moment the night is larger than all of it. It covers field and house, court and shore, master and labourer alike, with the same cool darkness. And in that darkness, the human heart keeps its own soft vigil. It remembers, it grieves, it protects, it hopes. Very quietly, the night holds it all.